It's time now for French Connections, our weekly look at the intricacies of life here in France with Florence Villeneuve. Hi, Flo. Now, this week we're going to focus on counter-terrorism. France has been under a state of emergency for nearly 2 years now, with exceptional security measures put in place after the attacks in November 2015. Measures that were meant to be temporary, but that could become permanent.
Well, what's interesting is when Emmanuel Macron was running for president, he vowed to get France out of the state of emergency. And so the government has proposed an alternative. This is a brand new counter-terrorism bill that's meant to be voted into law this autumn. But critics say there's actually not that much that's new about these new measures. They say it's actually just going to enshrine into law many of the measures that were meant to be exceptional during the state of emergency. And essentially all this could push France towards a permanent state of emergency.
Now, it is this state of emergency that's come under heavy criticism from rights groups. Authorities have the power to place people under house arrest. They can order house searches, ban public gatherings without the prior approval of a judge. Walk us through the new measures.
Well, the new measures are kind of like a photocopy of a photocopy. So the broad strokes are the same, but there are some differences from the state of emergency. You can see them here. Essentially, house arrests, for instance, will be replaced by the surveillance of individuals. Meanwhile, state authorities will be allowed to establish what they're calling security zones, essentially where people are subject to identity checks and searches. They'll also be able to shut down places of worship. And this time, with the approval of a judge, they'll be able to order search and seizure operations. They will now be called visits, but essentially that is a fancy word for what is essentially a police raid.
Now, according to a recent poll, a majority of French people say they're actually in favor of the new measures, but there's been lots of criticism from across the political spectrum and for different reasons.
That's right. Now, conservatives say that these new measures don't go far enough given the very real threat of terrorist attacks that we have here in France. And meanwhile, the left says that these new measures go too far. It's a controversial topic, to say the least.
This is a gift to the enemies of our republic who expect us to change our system. The law will trample on our freedom.
Once a fair balance between security and freedom is no longer possible, as far as I'm concerned, and I think a lot of French people will agree with me, I'm ready to sacrifice a little bit of my freedom for security for everyone.
Now, this is a big deal here in France, but a lot of people are paying attention outside as well. You have UN experts who have actually weighed in, calling on France to bring these new measures into line with international rights obligations.
Now, if you have traveled to France in the past couple of years, you might have noticed military personnel patrolling the streets of not just Paris, but lots of big cities in France, guarding major tourist sites. And that's also part of these official anti-terrorism measures.
That's right. Patrolling soldiers has, I guess, become the new normal here in France. Now, part of this is part of something called the Plan Vigipirate, which has been around for decades, where soldiers patrol areas like airports, train stations, tourist sites, etc. But following the Charlie Hebdo attacks in January 2015, the government reinforced the Plan Vigipirate with something called the Opération Sentinelle. These are some 10,000 soldiers patrolling sensitive locations around France, including 7,000 soldiers in the Paris region, so quite a lot in the Paris region. It's a very costly operation. It costs about €1 million a day, but many people say it's worth that cost just to feel safe.
Even if it's dangerous for them, it's necessary for us. A soldier's mission is to protect civilians.
That gives the tourists a lot of safety feeling to come to Paris, because otherwise I didn't come.
The other day, an old lady stopped me in the street to tell me how reassuring our presence is, and not just regarding the threat of terrorism, but also delinquency. It was touching. It made me realize that what we're doing isn't useless.
Now, members of this Opération Sentinelle, or this Sentinel operation, have increasingly become targets themselves, with recent incidents at the Louvre Museum, at the Orly Airport in Paris.
And the thing is, though many people say this operation makes them feel safe, it also has some critics who say it's actually not cost-effective.
These soldiers won't stop attacks from happening. They'd have to be everywhere or in the right place at the right time. Their purpose is to intervene once an attack happens. So in a way, the mission symbolizes the failure of intelligence and security services.
The government has vowed to review the Opération Sentinelle to make it more efficient and adapted to the current threat of terrorism. But soldiers aren't the only ones who are feeling a little bit worn out, overstretched, etc. The police as well has been calling for more means from the government.
Now, anti-terrorism means patrolling the streets, of course, but it also means more intelligence work. And France has a large number of spy agencies.
France has a half dozen agencies that are dedicated to intelligence work. Now, two of the main ones that you'll hear a lot about have confusingly similar names or acronyms, I guess you could say, and they are our word du jour or our acronyms du jour. You can see you have the DGSE, that's the Direction Générale de la Sécurité Extérieure. It's the foreign intelligence agency that answers to the Ministry of Defense. And you have the DGSI in France. That is the Direction Générale de la Sécurité Intérieure. It's the domestic intelligence agency that answers to the Ministry of the Interior. Now, critics say that there are too many of these agencies and they don't communicate efficiently amongst themselves. And here, once again, the president has vowed to fly to the rescue. Emmanuel Macron wants to set up a national counter-terrorism center, a one-stop shop, if you will, to coordinate these different intelligence agencies, a task force that will answer directly to him. Now, authorities say that thanks to all these measures, France has managed to foil several terrorist attacks over the past couple of years, but they certainly are buckling down for a long fight against terrorism here in France.
Florence, thank you so much for that. Florence Villeminot there with this episode of French Connections focusing on security here in France, a very critical issue, of course. Don't forget, if you want to ask Flo about anything else that concerns life in France, you can always send her a tweet at Flo Villeminot.